speaking of aggrieved populations, this came up a few days back. There was a couple of years ago, or a few years, might have been nearly a year or so ago, talk about alternative therapies for treatment of certain psychological conditions, primarily PTSD. The talk was about the trialing or the introduction of psychedelic therapies, microdosing MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine therapies. Now, in Australia at the time, none of those therapies had been approved, and none of those therapies had been, and I think cannabis as well. But I think it was more in terms of like THC oils, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But basically, the determinations at the time were that none of these alternative therapies were going to be approved. The TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, was saying, look, no, we're not going to approve trials or anything like that. There was promising trial results coming out of the US and I think Canada as well of the potential for some of these therapies to have effect in the treatment of treatment-resistant PTSD and depression, and I think there's another illness that they were effective in as well. But PTSD was the big one, and it was interesting at the time from a number of viewpoints. One was, well, you're using what is in essence an illegal drug in all other uses for therapeutic purposes. Second is that a lot of the cohort who would be using it or initially identified for using it would be ex-military. So people who'd come out of an environment where any sort of drug use, illicit drug use, was very much frowned upon, not permitted, etc. So you're introducing a trial of therapy using a restricted drug on a class of people who, well, in theory, never went anywhere near it. Practice, probably some people did, but it was interesting at the time, and certainly there were approved treatments and everything else like EMDR, CBT, all that sort of stuff. But in the wake of the Royal Commission that recently happened, last year before, whenever it was, into veteran suicides and how defence handled, I guess, it was a cultural thing as well. But from a treatment perspective, these alternative therapies were shelved at the time. Now, I'd subsequently been made aware that ketamine therapy was proceeding in on a trial basis, but you needed to be part of the trial in order to receive it, and it was obviously under trial, so there were no promises. Well, they weren't promising outcomes anyway, but part of the trial was to ascertain what effect it would have on resistant PTSD. Yeah, I think the trial was just PTSD patients. And microdosing of ketamine therapy under... I forget who was running it. I think it was Sydney, I believe. But anyway, so they're turning up more money for rehabilitation. But the thing that was most interesting to come out of this was, okay, yeah, reintegrate social life, rehabilitation plans. DVA will also begin funding medicinal cannabis, MDMA, and psilocybin treatment where eligible, with funding to develop other modern treatment methods. Now, depending on where you were in the country, you could potentially, and I guess the sort of GP and specialists you were seeing, there were there was the potential to access THC oils, tinctures. Now, they were never fully approved or really approved. Didn't stop people from using them, but they were very rarely used by people, and people knew that they were sort of skirting legality when using them and engaging with them. But to have, I guess, a big step forward to say that, yeah, no, these things that were proposed a couple of years ago and seemed very promising in terms of their outcomes, we're now going to actually fund them, which is, I think, very progressive, and it's going to have an effect far beyond just Australia. Because realistically, at the moment, these treatments are still in trial phases elsewhere in the world as well. If DVA here in Australia pours funding into it and it becomes accessible to PTSD sufferers that DVA look after, and it's shown to be effective, then that's going to provide a lot of evidence to other bodies around the world to allow these sort of treatments for their patients as well, be they military or otherwise. So it's a big step forward, not just for Australian PTSD sufferers, but also for people who suffer from the psychological conditions or psychiatric conditions that would benefit from these sort of treatments elsewhere in the world as well. So it's certainly something to be observed for. Funding, enhanced funding from now, yoga, surf therapy, cooking lessons, short education courses, expand support, that's rehabilitation, reintegration. Medicinal cannabis for chronic pain and other illnesses. But this MDMA and psilocybin treatment, which falls in line with how the ketamine therapies were being done as well, is for the worst cases, so the treatment-resistant cases. So I'm guessing the candidates will have to have gone through the various other gold standards of treatment, like EMDR, CBT. I mean, there's probably half a dozen treatment models that are considered gold standard for PTSD treatment. Things like exposure therapy, EMDR, CBT, family therapy. I think it's called family therapy. And there's be another one as well that I can't think of at the moment. But yeah, so people who've been through that and are still continuing to suffer from their symptoms rather badly would potentially become viable candidates for this. So that'd be, like I said, it'd be a good thing to see when it comes through. Social wellbeing activities worth up to $2,000 per person supported. Okay, accepted claim for compensation. So yeah, this means that it's only available for people who've already jumped through the hoops with DVA of getting accepted, which not as bad as the US VA system, but it can still be very difficult for Australian veterans who didn't have their conditions well documented whilst they're in the system, and having them accepted. And it's one of those weird things that when people are in, they want to hide the existence of these things because they know that they'll get given the flick, they'll be discharged. So it's almost a prisoner's dilemma as to whether or not you take steps to acknowledge the condition that you're suffering from, because the consequences could be very difficult. So yeah, it came out of reforms due to begin in July. It's come out of various other bits and pieces, and the other bits and other, like the commissions, royal commissions, and whatnot. Music lessons, art courses, community group memberships, sporting club memberships. Huh. Activities for medical treatment, travel, meals, and accommodation, of course, is already on offer. Would not be eligible. Yep, okay, fair enough. Loss of identity, reintegration, trying to stop people from being lost once cut free from defence. There's anything else worth noting here? Okay, so it said in 2023, first country in the world to permit authorised treatments using MDMA and psilocybin. But yeah, accessing those was very difficult. And yes, it is extraordinarily expensive, especially the ketamine one, where basically my understanding from what having had described to me is that it's conducted under the direction of a psychiatrist, but you've got an anesthesiologist, I think, actually administering the ketamine under a sedation. So, yeah. They're basically saying that people who just non-resistant. So, yeah, a lot of people want to use these drugs too, but if there's a miracle cure for things like PTSD, we probably already have it. Yeah. Treatment is very intensive, involving prep sessions, multiple dosing sessions, and follow-up. Yeah, I mean, sounds like things like exposure work and EMDR, where you've got to dig through all the nasty stuff as it goes on. Yeah, so look, that's certainly a very interesting thing to see, and I guess, like I said, it's going to be very, very promising for not just Australian veterans and Australian patients,